this target, which is one that's more pertinent to what I'm talking about today, is about the actual area of territory, whether it's terrestrial or marine, that is supposed to be included in systems of protected areas. And by systems of protected areas, they're not saying managed or owned or controlled by government. They're invoking that whole suite that I was telling you about earlier, but also another concept which we have yet to interpret, which came out at some late night negotiations, that other effective area-based conservation measures, whatever those are. And so we were a little bit worried about this because it sort of opens the door to saying, well, you can go and do anything, just manage your pine plantation really well for moles or something. And then it's not exactly what we had in mind. But the important thing is that a lot of countries, including Japan and China, supported a reduction in the marine target, even though we've conserved less than 1%. And people were shooting for 20% in the terrestrial environment, and the deal was 17%, which is an increase over the 10%. So I see Tony Robello at the back there. Tony, there's no scientific basis for these numbers whatsoever, and that's actually the trick. Because the real thing is, what constitutes conservation? These are minima. So the question is, how much of what do you need to conserve biodiversity and ecosystem services and all those other cultural and spiritual values, and at the same time ensure that they're effectively and equitably managed? And these are like throwaway extra terms that you could add on. But I think also importantly integrated into the wider landscape, seascape. So that is, this is progress, quite magnificent progress, and I don't think anyone believed Nagoya would deliver something that was actually asking the world to do more. You might have your, and then of course there's also, I left this slide out and then I thought, well, I couldn't come to SANBI and leave out species conservation. It all depends where you want to start solving this problem. And that is one of the dilemmas. Is that protected areas are not the purpose of conservation; they're a means to an end. Conservation of species clearly conserves biodiversity, but the things that cause the reduction in species or extinction of species are not addressed by the conservation of species per se. Okay. Then there's a very strong reference to ecosystem services, human health, livelihoods, well-being, and the concept of ecosystem resilience in relation to the climate conundrum. So for the first time, we've actually seen the CBD embracing really strongly, and it was supported really strongly by SANBI and its policy advocacy, to include references to climate, to resilience, to these other levels in terms of this convention. And then finally, which I mentioned obliquely just now, national governments are actually being asked to revise their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Japanese put up the money, $500,000 for every country, every developing country in the world. And it's in this context that SANBI is once again named as being potential support to national governments to do this. And then of course there's the big million-dollar question of where is the money coming from? And that's an incredibly weak target. So that was so much for the biodiversity policy. I think we're all very pleased with what happened in Nagoya, and of course our challenge is to do something with it. And maybe with that little extra fillip of encouragement in Mexico, the climate conference similarly achieved some really important things. I won't go into them in great detail because I think you know what they are. But on mitigation, in other words, reducing what is causing climate change, reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the reduction of forest cover leading to reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation actually went forward, and the final there's a work plan to figure out how to do this. So South Africa is hosting this meeting in December this year and hoping to clinch this deal. Most of the risk, and it's not only in forests, obviously other ecosystems contain carbon, so I think all of us should be arguing why other carbon-rich habitats should equally be eligible for these kinds of public funding support. And really what has been important is that instead of carbon just being seen as a commodity, trees as carbon as opposed to trees as biodiversity, there's been a really strong move in the Climate Convention, and again supported by a lot of us working really hard to make sure that there are social, environmental and governance safeguards in place, that rights and people are respected, and that biodiversity and other benefits are optimized. So this is huge progress from a couple of years ago. So we now have an adaptation framework with guiding principles. A fund will be set up to support those. And I'm not going to go into more of that. So these are just a couple of things that I was thinking about, saying, well, what we've seen in the last couple of years is growing convergence. People understanding these cause and effect relationships, that these conventions that were born in Rio 20 years ago were not twins separated from birth, one fed, the other starved. That actually we have to conserve biodiversity if we're going to solve the climate problem. We have to solve the climate problem if we're going to actually conserve biodiversity and support life on Earth. And that there's this recognition, a really strong recognition of ecosystem-based approaches to doing this. And yet very little going into what that means. What is an ecosystem-based approach and how would you do it and is it cost-effective and so on. So I think that's our challenge, is that we've made the arguments, governments have bought into it, and the world is poised to implement. But what we should all be doing is showing that it can be done and how it can be done and what it will cost and what it will take. And that's really where we came from when we put this book together, was to say, well, there were things that could be done. And we were really keen to make sure that we sold that message. So you could say, at one level, we wanted to collect all the evidence we could from proper, researched, evidence-based work, and amass that evidence, and then say what you could do with it. So, essentially the argument is simple, and I don't have time to go into it in great detail today, but where the world was coming from on mitigation was that we had to ensure that carbon remained in storage in natural ecosystems and wasn't released into the atmosphere, and we had to capture carbon and put it into natural ecosystems. The whole premise of the Climate Convention was that we had to solve that problem. A very secondary issue was, well, what if we don't solve this problem? And of course we haven't solved the problem. And so we're seeing outrageous, changes in weather events. We're seeing pastoralists having to move. We're seeing island fishing communities having to get up and move to other islands. And so this issue of adaptation came really strongly to the fore. So we were saying, well, we've got 120,000 odd protected areas on the planet. What are they doing to help or hinder this problem? And should you be spending more of your time doing that? And did they have a role in both mitigation and adaptation? So we went into the details, and I'll just rush through. I think I've already covered that. One of the studies that we did was to go and look at how much carbon was stored in systems of protected areas. And we found that disproportionate, I sort of think of Tony, because I remember Tony saying, no better than random. But actually this was better than random for some serendipitous reason. But there's more carbon stored more securely in the world's systems of protected areas than in not in protected areas. So the question is, why? Is it the governance regime? Is it the management quality? What is it? And at least that was an important starting point. And when you look at it at a sub-regional level, this is a part of the Amazon, and this is the state of, deforestation of the Amazon in Rhodonia. The brown is the 97, the blue is the 2000, and then there's more recent since then. If you look at what else is in that region, these are the protected areas that are established by government in the Amazon, and these are the protected areas that are in the hands of indigenous peoples. So, the boundary line between what is deforested and what is not deforested is in fact the existence of the protected area system, which is a pretty graphic result that said, by investing in that, we're actually holding our own. The question then is, what do you do about this to avoid, what is obviously already happening in these areas? As corporates go in and logging concessions are granted and so on, there's that potential to erode even that. So the issue is that protected areas are really important for doing this job, but we've still got to figure out how to stop them failing at doing a job, or how to do that better. So it's, one particular thing would be that instead of only focusing on, let's say, the persistence or representativity of richness of species in protected area design, we have to start thinking about what are those ecosystem processes that those areas encompass that should be part of that selection mechanism. And we've got to make protected areas eligible for the kinds of funding, because they're not, because they're protected. So people say, well, you don't need to put money into them. We need to put money into the places that are not protected. But as you can see, it's a complicated thing. If you look at adaptation briefly, the mitigation gap, if you like, creates an adaptation demand, which is growing and increasingly expensive. So we really tried to put forward the notion of ecosystem-based adaptation. Now, Guy Midgley was part of an ad hoc technical expert working group, working with others that put together these guidelines. But finally, people accepted that there could be such a notion of ecosystem-based approaches to adaptation, with the orientation not how do we prevent ecosystems being damaged by climate change, which is the conventional thinking, but how do we secure ecosystems to be the vehicle for assisting society to cope with climate change. So we went into those arguments as well. And working with the World Bank, and I was working at the Nature Conservancy, we tried to find case study evidence for whether this would work. Essentially, the argument really goes around this, and I'm going to start with this next slide, that the conservation community traditionally, I don't know about here, traditionally is looking at the exposure and sensitivity of ecosystems to these impacts. With the suggestion is that, if the ecosystems are in fact vulnerable, that will have consequences for society. But this argument doesn't actually persuade anybody why you should invest in ecosystems, because it's the development community that is looking at the risk to people, increased disaster risks, exposure to hazards, and of course the kind of emergency relief that's required, which is incredibly expensive. But it takes a lot of argument to get back up the line saying, well, if you didn't stop the deforestation in the first place, you wouldn't have the landslide, that caused the crisis downstream. So what we've been doing is assembling evidence about what kinds of integrity of ecosystems will protect what kinds of things. So I won't go into the detail. But clearly, when you look at something like South Africa's Working for Water program, that's a typical adaptation strategy. It wasn't necessarily consciously an adaptation strategy, but it delivers an adaptation response. And similarly, managing fire in an ecosystem under changing climate regimes. But one of the biggest issues, and one that's very, very compelling, is that more people in the world die of environmental related causes than any other cause. And so in terms of just straight mortality, adaptation is supported. So we've really got to understand how you manage these systems to be able to deliver those kinds of solutions. And that's not so obvious, because if you walk out of the door here and go and speak to the average protected area manager, they do not know what you're talking about.